There is a category of secret that governments go to extraordinary lengths to protect. Not the kind stored in vaults or encrypted on secure servers. The kind that only exists in conversation. The kind that's spoken aloud, quietly, between two people who believe, with absolute certainty, that no one else is listening. This story is about one of those conversations, and about what happens when that certainty is wrong. In July 2013, a Gulfstream G650 touched down at Geneva International Airport. Registration clean, flight plan routine. The aircraft taxied to a private terminal operated by a firm called Alpine Executive Aviation, a discreet handling company that catered to the kind of clients who paid for invisibility. The plane belonged to a senior Qatari prince. Its estimated cost, somewhere north of $90 million, once you factored in the custom communication suite, the enhanced encryption systems, the cabin modifications designed to make it something more than a luxury aircraft. It was, to all practical purposes, a mobile secure facility. A conference room at 40,000 feet. It was scheduled to be on the ground for 8 hours. At 10 in the morning, a cleaning crew boarded the aircraft. Standard procedure. 4 technicians, rolling carts, cleaning supplies. The kind of mundane, invisible labor that makes the world function without anyone noticing. 73 minutes later, they walked off. The plane looked exactly as it had before. It was not. Months later, somewhere in a Qatari maintenance facility, engineers would begin to dismantle that same aircraft, not because of mechanical failure, not because of wear and tear, but because Qatar's security apparatus could no longer be certain what might be hidden inside it. The interior would be stripped to its frame, every panel removed, every wire examined, every cushion pulled apart. The total cost of the rebuild, over $8 million. The question that hung over all of it was not whether the aircraft had been compromised. By that point, Qatar's security officials were operating on the assumption that it had. The question was, when had the people who believed they were in control actually lost it? That gap, between the moment control is lost and the moment that loss is discovered, is where intelligence operations live, and this operation was among the most sophisticated of its era. This documentary does not glorify covert surveillance. It examines how governments make decisions when they believe conventional channels have failed, and what those decisions cost in diplomatic currency, in legal standing, and in the long-term logic of the intelligence game itself. What you are about to hear is drawn from fragmentary evidence, intelligence reporting, and the public record of events that most of the governments involved would prefer remained invisible. To understand why a Gulfstream G650 became a priority intelligence target, you have to understand Qatar. And Qatar is not easy to understand, because it is built, deliberately, on contradiction. It is a country smaller than the state of Connecticut. Its population, including foreign workers, barely exceeds 3 million people. It sits on one of the largest natural gas reserves on the planet, and it has converted that geological accident into geopolitical leverage with a precision that larger, more powerful nations have found alternately impressive and infuriating. Qatar hosts the largest American military installation in the Middle East, Al Udeid Air Base, from which the United States has launched operations across Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and beyond. Without Qatar's cooperation, American power projection across the region would look fundamentally different. That relationship gives Qatar a degree of protection that money alone could never purchase. At the same time, Qatar has provided political shelter to Hamas leadership. It has funded media infrastructure, most visibly Al Jazeera, that has consistently challenged the narratives of regional governments, including American allies. It has served as a mediator between Israel and groups that Israel classifies as terrorist organizations, while simultaneously financing structures that Israel views as existential threats. It has maintained cordial relationships with Iran while sitting beneath an American security umbrella. None of this is accidental. Qatar's leadership understood early that a small nation survives not by picking sides, but by making itself indispensable to all of them. Strategic ambiguity is not a diplomatic failure. It is the policy. It is the point. For Israeli intelligence, that ambiguity presented a specific problem. Qatar was not an enemy in the conventional sense. It was something more complicated. A state whose financial networks directly enabled groups that had killed Israeli civilians, while simultaneously serving as a back channel that Israel occasionally needed. You couldn't simply cut off contact. You couldn't fully trust the contact you had. And you needed to know, with precision, not approximation, exactly what Qatar was doing and saying when it thought no one was watching. The challenge was operational. Qatar's leadership understood they were targets. Senior Qatari officials operated under the standing assumption that their phones were monitored, their residences were surveilled, and their digital communications had been penetrated by multiple foreign intelligence services. They were correct. The Americans watched them. The British watched them. The Iranians watched them. The Israelis watched them. In a country with Qatar's profile, the assumption of surveillance was not paranoia. It was rational risk management. So the most sensitive conversations migrated. They moved to locations that could be controlled, swept, and verified. One of those locations was the aircraft. The Prince's Gulfstream had been specifically configured with that purpose in mind. It carried encrypted communication systems. It underwent regular technical inspections by specialized contractors. Its maintenance was handled by personnel who had passed comprehensive security vetting. When the Prince needed to discuss matters that even Doha's secure facilities couldn't fully protect, he used the plane. He would fly to neutral cities, Geneva, Vienna, Zurich, conduct meetings on the ground, and conduct the truly sensitive conversations in the air, at altitude, between destinations. The logic was sound. An aircraft in flight is an electromagnetically hostile environment for external surveillance. Its metal and composite structure disrupts radio transmission. It moves constantly, making physical access impossible. And unlike an embassy or a palace, it carries no fixed infrastructure that an adversary might have had decades to penetrate. A custom aircraft, swept regularly by trusted technicians, maintained by a vetted crew, represented one of the most genuinely secure environments available to a head-of-state level official, operating in a world where sophisticated adversaries were always watching. Israeli intelligence had identified the pattern. The plane moved when things mattered. When Hamas negotiations reached a critical threshold, the Gulfstream was in the air. When sensitive financial arrangements were being finalized, the aircraft appeared in the flight logs of European airports. The conversations happening aboard that plane were precisely the conversations that Israeli planners most needed to hear. The Mossad's technical division began studying the problem in 2013. Analysts mapped the aircraft's operational profile with methodical precision. Where did it typically land? How long did it remain on the ground? Which service providers handled it? What access protocols governed those interactions? They obtained construction documents for the G650. Some through open-source channels. Gulfstream published maintenance manuals and configuration specifications that provided substantial structural detail. Some through contacts cultivated within the aviation industry, where information about high-profile aircraft often circulates informally among engineers and technicians who take professional pride in knowing what their peers are working on. They learned that the aircraft's major maintenance work, engine overhauls, avionics updates, significant interior work, was conducted at Gulfstream's facility in Luton, England. The initial concept was straightforward: infiltrate the Luton facility, compromise the aircraft during a scheduled maintenance visit. Detailed reconnaissance killed that plan quickly. Gulfstream's security at Luton was comprehensive. Background checks on all personnel, surveillance cameras throughout the maintenance bays, documentation requirements that meant every procedure had to be logged and supervisor reviewed. Even if Mossad could insert an operative into the maintenance crew, a process that would take months and carry significant exposure risk. The working environment made covert installation of surveillance hardware nearly impossible. Too many eyes. Too much documentation. Too little opportunity for the kind of unobserved, precise work that the operation required. The breakthrough came from an unexpected direction, and it came, as intelligence breakthroughs often do, from someone with entirely non-ideological motivations. In July 2013, a Swiss businessman named Eric Langford walked into the Israeli embassy. Langford ran a company called Alpine Executive Aviation, which provided ground handling services for private jets at Geneva's airport. The services were mundane: fueling, minor maintenance, cabin cleaning, catering coordination. The clients were wealthy and discreet, and they paid for both the service and the silence that came with it. Langford was not a recruited asset. He was what intelligence services call a walk-in, someone who presents themselves voluntarily, offering information or cooperation without having been developed or cultivated. His motivations were financial, not ideological. He had outstanding business disputes with Qatari clients who had failed to pay invoices. He believed that cooperation with Israeli services might provide leverage, or at minimum, compensation, that would offset his losses. His company handled the prince's Gulfstream during its Geneva stops, typically 6 to 8 hours on the ground while the prince attended meetings in the city. During those stops, Alpine's crew would service the aircraft, including interior cabin cleaning, a process that took roughly 90 minutes and required access to every section of the passenger compartment. Israeli intelligence officers met Langford in a Geneva hotel room to assess his reliability and the feasibility of what he was proposing. They administered a polygraph examination. The results indicated that while Langford was primarily motivated by financial grievance, he was being truthful about his access to the aircraft and his willingness to cooperate. He was offered a substantial payment structured as a consulting contract for aviation security assessments, the kind of legitimate-sounding arrangement that intelligence services use to compensate assets while maintaining cover. He was made to understand clearly that any deviation from agreed protocols would carry serious consequences. Langford accepted. The technical challenge that remained was formidable, not just installing surveillance devices. That, in principle, wasn't difficult. The difficulty was installing devices that would survive in this specific environment, devices small enough to be hidden in locations that would pass routine security inspections, robust enough to capture audio clearly and continuously, capable of transmitting that audio out of a structure built from materials specifically hostile to radio transmission, and designed to evade detection by the kind of sophisticated counter-surveillance sweeps that Qatar's security services would inevitably conduct. Standard surveillance hardware was inadequate on every count. Conventional listening devices required either physical wiring for signal transmission, which any inspection would immediately reveal, or battery power that would be exhausted within days or weeks. The aircraft's composite and metal construction created an electromagnetic environment that would disrupt standard radio transmission, making it difficult to push signals out of the fuselage without external antennas that would be immediately visible. Mossad's technical division spent 6 months developing a solution that represented the current frontier of surveillance technology. What they produced was not simply a miniaturized version of existing tools. It was a reconception of how surveillance hardware could function in a hostile physical environment. The devices they built were approximately the size of an eraser, small enough to be embedded within existing aircraft components in ways that made them physically indistinguishable from original equipment. But their technical architecture was what made them extraordinary. Power was derived through inductive coupling from the aircraft's existing electrical system. The devices drew minute amounts of current from wiring already present in the aircraft, eliminating the need for batteries entirely. The power draw was calibrated to fall within the tolerance range of normal system variation, the kind of fluctuation that standard electrical diagnostics would attribute to aging components or environmental factors, rather than unauthorized hardware. Audio transmission was achieved through a method called data injection. The devices converted captured sound into digital data and embedded it within the aircraft's existing communications infrastructure, piggybacking on legitimate signals in ways that appeared to any monitoring system as ordinary system noise. The transmitted data was encrypted using algorithms designed to make it indistinguishable from routine satellite communications traffic. Even if Qatar's signals intelligence detected anomalous transmissions, they would not be able to identify them as surveillance data. Critically, the devices were programmed to remain dormant while the aircraft was on the ground, activating only when the plane was airborne and at cruise altitude. This addressed the single greatest risk: security sweeps. Qatar's technicians routinely scanned the aircraft for electronic anomalies while it was stationary. By remaining inert during those inspections, the devices would produce no electronic signature that counter-surveillance equipment could detect. The receiving station was a modified communications satellite operated by Israel under commercial cover, allowing the intelligence service to capture audio transmissions without requiring ground-based receivers that might expose Israeli involvement. The technical sophistication of what Mossad had developed was, even by the standards of elite intelligence services, exceptional. What they had created was hardware that could operate inside one of the most carefully protected private environments in the world, without power source vulnerabilities, without detectable transmission signatures, and without physical characteristics that distinguished it from the legitimate components surrounding it. In February 2014, Alpine Executive Aviation received notification that the Prince's aircraft would stop in Geneva on March 8th for an 8-hour stay. The operation moved into final preparation. Mossad deployed a 4-person technical team to Geneva. They traveled under separate cover identities: an independent aviation consultant, a private security specialist, an equipment vendor, arriving at intervals to avoid creating a pattern that airport security might register. They established themselves at a hotel near the airport and began final rehearsals. For this phase, they worked with a physical replica of the G650's interior cabin, a mock-up constructed at a training facility in Israel that reproduced the exact dimensions, materials, and component configurations of the Prince's aircraft. The team practiced installation procedures until every member could execute their assigned tasks in darkness, under time pressure, leaving no physical evidence of their presence. They wore gloves throughout. They used tools designed not to leave marks. They rehearsed the specific sequence of physical movements required to open, modify, and reseal each target location. Langford briefed the team on the exact sequence of events that would occur when the aircraft arrived. The Qatari security detail would deplane first, conducting a visual inspection of the hangar and surrounding area. Alpine's ground crew would then approach the aircraft to begin fueling and servicing. The cleaning crew, 4 individuals, would board approximately 20 minutes after arrival and work through the cabin for 90 minutes. Langford had arranged that 2 of his regular cleaning crew members would be unavailable that day, citing a scheduling conflict. Their positions would be filled by temporary workers, the Mossad technicians, whose false employment documents and background credentials Langford had prepared weeks earlier. On the morning of March 8th, the Prince's aircraft landed at Geneva at 9:47 local time. It taxied to Alpine's hangar, where the Qatari security detail performed their standard inspection before allowing ground crew to approach. At 10:05, the cleaning crew boarded. 2 were genuine Alpine employees who had no knowledge of what was actually occurring. 2 were Mossad technicians carrying cleaning materials and equipment that concealed the surveillance devices and installation tools. What followed unfolded with choreographed precision. The 2 operatives worked alongside the legitimate crew members, maintaining the appearance of normal cleaning duties while executing their actual mission. One operative focused on the forward cabin, the section where the prince typically conducted meetings. She installed 3 devices. The first was embedded in the leather upholstery of the prince's preferred seat. Accessed through a small incision along an existing seam, the device inserted into the cushion filling, the seam resealed with an adhesive chemically identical to the original. The second was placed within the housing of an overhead reading light, the operative removing the fixture, embedding the device in a cavity designed to resemble original wiring insulation, then reassembling the fixture to its prior configuration. The third was installed behind a decorative wood panel, inserted into a drilled cavity, sealed with wood filler, stained to match the surrounding surface. The second operative worked the central conference area of the cabin, installing 2 devices at positions that provided comprehensive audio coverage. One was embedded within the frame of a video monitor used for presentations, appearing as part of the screen's internal electronics. The second was placed within the metal housing of the conference table's support structure, accessible through a removable maintenance panel designed for servicing the table's motorized adjustment mechanism. Each installation was documented with miniature cameras, recording placement positions for later technical reference. The entire operation was completed in 73 minutes. The cleaning crew departed at 11:18. The aircraft was immaculate. It was also comprehensively compromised. Qatar's security personnel conducted a final visual inspection before the prince boarded for his afternoon departure. They found nothing unusual. The aircraft's technical systems showed no anomalies. To every observer, the service stop had been entirely routine. The devices transmitted their first operational data on March 9th, as the prince flew from Geneva back to Doha. Israeli signals intelligence stations received encrypted transmissions that, when decoded, delivered clear audio of a conversation between the prince and a senior Hamas official who had been permitted to travel aboard the aircraft. The conversation, conducted in Arabic, covered financial arrangements for Hamas operations in the West Bank, discussions of weapons smuggling routes through Sudan, and candid assessments of which Palestinian Authority officials might be receptive to Qatari pressure to reduce cooperation with Israeli security forces. For 18 months, the surveillance operation delivered unprecedented insight into Qatari regional diplomacy. Analysts in Tel Aviv received regular transcripts covering hostage negotiation frameworks, financial transfers to Hamas, mediation efforts between rival Palestinian factions, and Qatar's coordination with Turkey and Iran on regional strategy. The intelligence was extraordinarily valuable. It informed Israeli diplomatic approaches during a period when understanding Qatari intentions was critical to managing regional relationships. It revealed the true scope of Qatari financial support for Hamas, figures that substantially exceeded publicly acknowledged amounts. It identified specific individuals within Hamas and Palestinian Authority structures who were effectively operating as Qatari agents, receiving direction and funding in ways that formal diplomatic channels obscured. But the operation also revealed something that Israeli analysts had not fully anticipated: the internal tensions within Qatar's own approach to Hamas. In multiple intercepted conversations, the prince expressed frustration with Hamas leadership, describing them as difficult partners who made unrealistic demands and failed to understand the political constraints Qatar faced in defending its relationship with the group to Western allies. These conversations indicated that Qatar's support for Hamas was transactional rather than ideological, maintained because it gave Qatar leverage over Palestinian politics and enhanced its regional standing, but viewed by Qatar's own leadership as a liability that required careful management. That nuance was strategically significant. It suggested that Qatar's relationship with Hamas was not an immovable commitment, but a calculated position, one that, under the right pressure and with the right incentives, might be adjusted. Israeli intelligence used this insight to calibrate diplomatic pressure on Qatar with greater precision than would have been possible through conventional channels. Instead of confronting Qatar publicly over Hamas support, a move that would almost certainly have been dismissed as Israeli propaganda, and that would have required revealing the existence and methods of the surveillance operation. Mossad took a more surgical approach. Selected intelligence from the aircraft intercepts was shared with American officials, not the raw transcripts, not anything that would immediately expose the collection method, but specific, precise details, account numbers, transfer amounts, the names of intermediaries, the language used in conversations that Qatar had every reason to believe were private. The specificity of what American diplomats received was itself a message. When U.S. officials confronted their Qatari counterparts with details of financial transfers to Hamas, details that could only have come from signals intelligence of extraordinary quality, it created a particular kind of pressure. Qatar's officials understood that someone had gotten close. They didn't know how close. They didn't know what else had been collected. And that uncertainty was, from Israel's perspective, nearly as valuable as the intelligence itself. Qatar's public position had long been that its financial transfers to Gaza were humanitarian, support for hospitals, schools, infrastructure. What the intercepts documented was something more complicated. Conversations in which Qatari officials discussed, in explicit terms, how funds designated as humanitarian aid were being redirected by Hamas for military purposes, and how Qatar's oversight of those transfers was, at best, limited. The gap between Qatar's public assurances and its private awareness was now documented, and selected American officials were being made quietly aware of that gap. This is how sophisticated intelligence gets used, not through dramatic revelations, through the slow, calibrated application of specific knowledge in diplomatic settings where the other party cannot be certain how much you know or how you know it. The operation's exposure did not come from Qatar. It came from inside. In August 2015, a former Mossad technical officer, dismissed from the service following a separate security violation, approached European journalists. He was attempting to negotiate payment for information about Israeli intelligence operations. His motivations were financial. His knowledge, unfortunately for the operation, was substantial. Among the operations he described was a long-running surveillance program targeting the diplomatic aircraft of a Gulf state. He did not name the specific aircraft or the Qatari prince. He did not have granular operational details about the Geneva installation, but his general description was precise enough. The targeting of a Gulf royal family member's private jet, the use of concealed hardware, the collection of diplomatic conversations, to trigger comprehensive security reviews across multiple Gulf states that feared they might be the target. Qatari security services, already operating on the standing assumption that their communications were being targeted by multiple intelligence services, ordered full technical inspections of the royal family's aircraft fleet. The inspections were conducted by a European security firm specializing in technical surveillance countermeasures, a company with a reputation for thoroughness that Qatar had specifically selected because they wanted an assessment that would be trusted. The technicians who conducted the sweep were good. They disassembled interior panels. They examined wiring systems with advanced diagnostic equipment. They analyzed electronic components for anomalies. They found nothing. The Mossad devices had been integrated too deeply into the aircraft's existing systems. They appeared, on every examination that stopped short of molecular analysis, as original equipment. The power draw fell within normal system variants. The transmission signature was indistinguishable from routine satellite communications traffic. The physical appearance of each device matched the surrounding components in material composition, coloring, and form factor. But Qatar's security officials were operating on a principle that intelligence professionals understand well. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. They could not find the devices. That did not mean the devices were not there, and the consequences of assuming they were not there, if that assumption was wrong, were unacceptable. They ordered a complete interior rebuild of the aircraft. The cabin was stripped to its structural frame. every panel removed, every cushion replaced, every electronic component examined, and, where any doubt existed, substituted with new hardware sourced through verified channels. The work was performed at Gulfstream's facility over 6 weeks. The cost exceeded $8 million. The surveillance devices, the product of 6 months of technical development, a year of patient operational preparation, and 18 months of successful collection, were destroyed in the process. Not discovered. Destroyed. Qatar never found them. They simply eliminated every component that might have contained them. Mossad's technical division monitored the situation through sources within the aviation industry who reported on the reconstruction work. The decision they faced was whether to attempt a second penetration. They chose not to. This is a decision worth examining carefully because it reveals something important about how mature intelligence services think about operations. The surveillance of the prince's aircraft had delivered 18 months of highly valuable collection. But attempting to re-penetrate the same target, after Qatar had demonstrated awareness that penetration was possible, would have required operational methods that significantly elevated exposure risk. It would have meant burning sources, potentially including Langford and the network of aviation industry contacts that had made the first operation possible. It would have risked exposing the technical methods that made the devices work, methods that were more broadly applicable than any single operation. And it would have been conducted against a target that was now actively hostile and specifically alert to the threat. The calculation was straightforward. The intelligence value of any future collection did not outweigh the value of preserving the capabilities and sources that had made the first collection possible. This is a principle that intelligence services articulate easily but find genuinely difficult to execute in practice. The bias toward action, toward continuing a successful operation, toward collecting more, is powerful. The discipline to stop, to protect methods and sources against future use, requires institutional restraint that not every service consistently applies. In this case, the restraint held. The Swiss government launched a quiet investigation into whether Alpine Executive Aviation had violated Swiss neutrality laws by facilitating a foreign intelligence operation on Swiss territory. The investigation ran into evidentiary problems that proved insurmountable. Langford, when questioned, denied any knowledge of intelligence activities. His company, he maintained, had provided routine cleaning services as contracted. Nothing more. The temporary employees who had actually installed the surveillance hardware had vanished, their false identities as thoroughly dismantled as the devices themselves. No physical evidence remained. The surveillance hardware had been destroyed during Qatar's reconstruction of the aircraft. The documentary trail led nowhere that could support criminal charges. Swiss prosecutors ultimately concluded that while an intelligence operation had clearly occurred, proving it in a manner that would sustain prosecution was impossible without testimony from participants who could not be identified or compelled to cooperate. The investigation closed without charges, without public findings, without, from the perspective of the Swiss legal system, a resolvable case. This outcome is not unusual. Covert intelligence operations are specifically designed to resist legal accountability. The use of false identities, compartmented operational security, and the deliberate elimination of physical evidence are not incidental features. They are core requirements. The architecture of the operation was built, among other things, to survive exactly the kind of subsequent investigation that the Swiss government attempted. For Mossad, the operation's legacy was complicated in ways that internal postmortems would wrestle with for years. On the collection side, it was an unambiguous success. 18 months of access to one of the most carefully protected private communication environments in the region. Transcripts of conversations that revealed the true mechanics of Qatar's Hamas relationship, the financial architecture, the operational coordination, the internal ambivalence that Qatar's own leadership felt toward its most controversial alignment. Intelligence that informed Israeli diplomatic strategy during a period when that understanding was genuinely consequential. But the exposure, even in its limited, non-specific form, had costs that extended beyond the loss of the collection itself. American officials, while privately acknowledging the intelligence value of Israeli operations targeting Hamas financiers, expressed concern about methods that complicated U.S. relationships with Gulf allies. Qatar was not simply a Hamas supporter. It was also a country hosting American military infrastructure, without which U.S. regional operations would be significantly constrained. Operations that put Qatar on the defensive, that created diplomatic friction between Washington and Doha, created secondary effects that American policymakers had to manage. Israel's intelligence value was real. But so was the diplomatic friction that aggressive Israeli collection operations could generate. European intelligence services that maintained liaison relationships with Mossad, relationships built on shared counterterrorism interests and mutual intelligence exchange, began asking whether Israeli operations were becoming too aggressive. The concern was institutional. If Israeli operations in European jurisdictions were compromised, the exposure would force host governments to publicly acknowledge what they had privately tolerated. That created political risk for the liaison relationships that both sides depended on. Mossad's operational ambition and the stability of its European partnerships existed in tension, and the Geneva operation had tightened that tension. The dismissed technical officer whose indiscretion had triggered Qatar's security review became, within Mossad's institutional culture, a case study in operational security failure. And not only because he had violated his clearance. The more systemic lesson was about compartmentalization. He had known about an operation he had no direct operational role in. The information existed in his awareness because Mossad's internal culture had, over time, allowed knowledge of successful operations to circulate more widely than strict security protocols required. Pride in achievement is a human impulse. In intelligence services, it is also a vulnerability. The operation reinforced the institutional imperative to limit operational knowledge to those with a direct, specific need, not as bureaucratic formality, but as genuine protection against the unpredictable ways in which disgruntled or compromised personnel can damage operations they were never meant to know existed. The prince's adaptation to the suspected surveillance was, in its own way, instructive. He could not prove Israeli involvement. The sophistication of the operation and the absence of any physical evidence that survived Qatar's reconstruction of the aircraft meant that his suspicion, however well-founded, remained unprovable. He did not publicly accuse Israel. Doing so would have required presenting evidence he didn't have, and would have exposed Qatari security vulnerabilities to scrutiny he didn't want. Instead, he adapted. Sensitive conversations that had previously occurred aboard the aircraft migrated to environments where Qatar could exercise more complete control. Meetings moved to palaces in Doha, equipped with sophisticated counter-surveillance systems that Qatar had sourced from European providers and maintained with a level of technical rigor that the aircraft, for all its protections, could not replicate. Some conversations moved outdoors, locations where electronic surveillance is operationally difficult, where the absence of fixed infrastructure eliminates entire categories of collection risk. Some moved to secure facilities in Turkey, a country with which Qatar maintained deep and trusted security cooperation, and whose own counter-surveillance capabilities Qatar had reason to respect. Encrypted communication systems, sourced from European providers with strong reputations for cryptographic integrity, increasingly supplemented and in some cases replaced the in-person conversations that had previously been conducted aboard the aircraft. The conversations conducted through these systems were less candid. Participants aware that electronic communication, however encrypted, carries risks that face-to-face conversation does not. But they were also less vulnerable to the specific category of threat that the aircraft penetration represented. This adaptation illustrates something fundamental about the intelligence cycle that is easy to state and difficult to internalize. Every successful operation teaches the target. Qatar's security improved as a direct consequence of Israel's collection. The methods that had worked in Geneva would not work again, not because Qatar had discovered exactly what had been done, but because Qatar had raised the general cost and complexity of access to a level that would require new methods, new resources, and new exposure risk for any subsequent attempt. Mossad had gained 18 months of intelligence. The price was a more sophisticated, more alert, and more operationally cautious adversary. This is the fundamental dynamic of intelligence competition. It does not resolve, it escalates. Each side adapts to what it learns about the other's capabilities. The frontier of collection and the frontier of protection advance together, neither achieving permanent advantage. The aviation industry's response to reporting about sophisticated surveillance targeting private aircraft illustrates a broader pattern in how technical intelligence capabilities propagate through the world. Several firms began offering enhanced technical security sweeps specifically designed to detect the kind of power-harvesting devices that intelligence services had developed. Aircraft manufacturers incorporated tamper-evident seals on interior components and improved documentation of electrical systems that would reveal unauthorized modifications. Protocols for cleaning crews and service personnel at private terminals became more rigorous, with some operators introducing video monitoring of interior servicing work and more stringent vetting of temporary personnel. These measures raised the operational cost of the kind of access the Geneva operation had achieved. They did not eliminate it. They could not eliminate it, because the fundamental vulnerability that aircraft require regular servicing by human beings who must have physical access to interior spaces cannot be engineered away. What can be done is making that access more difficult to exploit covertly and raising the probability that an attempt will be detected. Every security measure introduced in response to the operation made future operations harder. None made them impossible. Gulfstream itself, the manufacturer whose aircraft had been penetrated, faced the awkward reality that the sophistication of the compromise said something uncomfortable about the limits of aircraft security as a category. A G650 was not a standard corporate jet. It was among the most sophisticated private aircraft available, purchased by clients who had specific security requirements and the resources to meet them. If that platform, with its custom security configurations and its professionally maintained technical systems, could be penetrated without detection for 18 months, what did that imply about the broader universe of private aviation that operated with less rigorous security standards? The answer, which no one in the industry was eager to articulate publicly, was that it implied quite a lot. Qatar's broader strategic position evolved in the years following the operation, though the relationship between the surveillance program and those evolutions is difficult to trace with precision. Qatar's support for Hamas did not end, but its public management of that relationship became noticeably more careful. The language Qatar used in diplomatic settings to describe its relationship with Hamas shifted. More emphasis on Qatar's role as a necessary mediator, less comfortable acknowledgement of the financial dimensions of that relationship. Whether this reflected the pressure applied through selectively shared American intelligence or simply Qatar's own evolving calculation about the costs of its Hamas alignment in a regional environment that was shifting, or some combination of both, is genuinely unclear. The hostage negotiation role that Qatar had developed, serving as the interlocutor between Israel and Hamas when direct communication was impossible, deepened rather than contracted. By the time the region reached its next acute crisis, Qatar's position as the indispensable back channel was more firmly established than ever. The country that Israel had surveilled remained the country that Israel, through intermediaries, needed. The contradiction at the heart of the relationship had not resolved. It had institutionalized. The prince continued his diplomatic activities. Conversations that had previously taken place aboard the aircraft now occurred in environments Qatar controlled more completely. His relationship with Hamas leadership continued. His role as Qatar's informal envoy for sensitive negotiations that formal diplomatic channels could not accommodate remained central to Qatari foreign policy. The surveillance had not disrupted the activity it was designed to illuminate. It had only changed the environment in which that activity occurred. What the operation ultimately demonstrated, across all of its dimensions, from the technical innovation of the devices themselves to the diplomatic calibration of how the intelligence was used to the institutional lessons drawn from its eventual exposure, was the deep structure of modern intelligence competition among states that are simultaneously adversaries and, in various configurations, necessary partners. Israel and Qatar were not at war. They maintained no formal diplomatic relations, but they communicated through intermediaries on matters of shared interest. Israeli intelligence collecting against Qatar was not an act of hostility in the conventional sense. It was an act of strategic positioning in an environment where information is the primary currency. Qatar, for its part, understood this. It did not respond to the suspected surveillance with a rupture of the informal channels that connected it to Israel. It adapted its operational security and continued doing what it had always done. This is the world that intelligence services actually inhabit, one where the boundaries between adversary and partner are consistently blurry, where the same state can be simultaneously surveilled and negotiated with, where operations designed to gain leverage over a counterpart coexist with diplomatic processes designed to manage relationships with that same counterpart. The legal and moral frameworks that govern these activities are, in practice, substantially less determinative than the strategic calculations that drive them. The Swiss legal system closed its investigation without resolution. International law provides no effective mechanism for adjudicating intelligence operations conducted by one state against officials of another state in the territory of a third, particularly when those operations are designed to leave no traceable evidence. The norm against surveillance of diplomatic communications exists. Its enforcement mechanism, in practice, is retaliatory action by states with the capability to respond in kind, not legal process. What remains of this operation is fragmentary. Intelligence reporting that revealed Israeli knowledge of conversations that Israeli sources should not have had access to. Diplomatic pressure campaigns that reference specific details of private discussions in ways that could only reflect signals intelligence collection. Aviation industry accounts of sophisticated surveillance operations targeting Gulf royalty circulating among professionals who recognize the technical signature of state-level capability, and an $8 million aircraft rebuild that Qatar authorized without publicly explaining why. Israeli intelligence has never officially confirmed the operation existed. Qatari officials have never publicly acknowledged suspecting their aircraft was compromised. The Swiss investigation concluded without public findings. The dismissed Mossad technical officer who triggered the exposure has not been publicly identified in connection with this specific operation. The devices themselves, the product of 6 months of engineering that represented a genuine advance in the technical frontier of covert surveillance, were destroyed in the rebuild of the aircraft they had been designed to penetrate. Whatever they captured in 18 months of operation exists, if at all, only in the classified archives of an intelligence service that has no interest in their public disclosure. The full operational record of what was heard aboard that aircraft, the conversations about Hamas finances, the assessments of Palestinian Authority vulnerabilities, the internal Qatari debates about the sustainability of their regional posture, will almost certainly remain classified for decades, perhaps permanently. There is a question that the operation leaves open, and it is the question that sits beneath all of the specific operational and diplomatic details. When a state determines that legal channels have failed, that conventional diplomacy cannot produce the information needed to make consequential decisions, that public confrontation would be counterproductive, that the only path to genuine understanding requires methods that violate the sovereignty and privacy of another state. What accountability structures govern that determination? Who decides when the threshold has been crossed? And what prevents that threshold from moving incrementally as each successful operation normalizes the methods it employed? Qatar's relationship with Hamas presented Israel with a genuine security problem. The financial flows that the operation documented were real. The conversations about weapons routes and payment arrangements were not fabricated. The intelligence that 18 months of collection produced had genuine operational value for a country whose citizens had been killed by organizations that Qatar was funding. And yet the operation required violations of Swiss law, the manipulation of commercial aviation infrastructure, and the surveillance of a foreign government official in ways that no international legal framework authorized. It required lying, systematically and comprehensively, to every party whose cooperation or absence of interference was necessary for the operation to succeed. Intelligence services make these calculations constantly. They are rarely visible. When they become visible, as this one partially did, they reveal an architecture of decision-making that operates largely outside the accountability structures that democratic societies apply to other instruments of state power. The aircraft was rebuilt. The devices were destroyed. The investigation closed. The prince continued his work. The intelligence was used. The relationship between Israel and Qatar, adversarial, necessary, surveilled, negotiated, continued in its permanently unresolved form, and somewhere in the classified archives of a service that has never confirmed this operation existed, the transcripts of 18 months of conversations aboard a Gulfstream G650 cite in a file that most people with the clearance to read it will never request, and most people who might request it will never receive. The question is not whether operations like this will continue. They will. The question is whether the world those operations inhabit, the world where states surveil each other's most sensitive communications, where legal accountability is a structural afterthought, where the threshold for crossing sovereign boundaries is set internally by the institutions doing the crossing, is a world that has been deliberately chosen, or simply one that has been inherited and never seriously examined, because the next aircraft is already in the air.